Hello, everybody. My name is Jason Corbett. I'm an independent game developer here based in Philadelphia. For over 4 years, I was a game designer at the local company PHL Collective. During my time at PHL, I worked on several titles, including Ben 10 Power Trip that you see here, Ben 10 Omnicharged, Goozy, Addams Family, and Justice League Cosmic Chaos, and a secret yet to be unreleased title. Hopefully that will come out. So hopefully I can talk about it soon. Oh God. So tonight I'm gonna say it's the economy, stupid. Lessons learned from my mistakes building progression systems. So a lot of these are bearing my regrets, the things that I'm like, oh, if I could just change that, or if they could let me patch it. But things go out into the ether and they're done. I'll start off by calling attention to another resource. Mark Brown's Game Maker's Toolkit has a good overview video on economies in games and some anecdotes and pitfalls from various games. And I encourage you to check it out to hear his own words. I'll drop the link at some point in the chat. I'll do it at the end. A quick overview that Mark Brown talks about are how money comes in and leaves the system, and these parameters can have massive effects on how the system works and the effect on player psychology. So definitely check that out. First example, in one of the earlier games that I worked on for PHL, Ben 10 Power Trip, we had a very rough idea of the amount of materials that players could procure during their playthrough and erred perhaps too much on the costlier side. Ben 10 was built around collecting upgrade orbs. Some of these were in the world, some of these got from bosses, stuff like that. Others we put in the shop. Here's we got Carla clams. We put them in each region's shop to kind of encourage people to, have something to do with their money. And but after watching playthroughs, it seemed that most players had to grind endgame content to get this much money, which sucks. Plus, it was tied to achievements, so it also sucked. So some of this might just come down to playtesting and having enough time to fully playtest everything that you're doing. But sometimes it's hard with a 10 to 15, 10-hour game, to play everything over and over again and figure out what your economy is. But that's another topic for another time. So be careful about overcosting your stuff. On the other side of the coin, in our next console game that we released, Addams Family Mansion Mayhem, we were perhaps too far in the other direction, and we're perhaps too forgiving for some awards, which kind of left them feeling a little, meaningless. In Mansion Mayhem, all the progression is kind of built around these crests that you collect, similar to stars in Super Mario 64 or moons in Super Mario Galaxy. It was a way for us to encourage going into level side areas, and it was integral to unlocking the next map in the world on the world map. During development, we ended up kind of at some point lowering the requirements that you needed to get of coins. So just like Mario 64, we had a crest from each level that said, all right, if you collect all the coins, you get a crest. And that was, made a lot of sense. But at a certain point, we're like, it's a little bit more forgiving. This is all the games that we made tended to be geared first towards younger audiences. So we wanted to be more forgiving. And we were pretty liberal with coins. It was like, 200 coins in a level, and that's kind of a lot to collect everywhere. So it kind of ended up being like 70% of each level's coins. But the side effect of that was once you collect that family crest found, collect 200 doubloons, and there's still a third of the level, you're like, well, do I need to keep searching? So it kind of had this sort of side effect of kind of taking the wind out of the rest of it. Ideally, we would have had multiple tiers of doubloon rewards, but that late in the process, that requires redesigning the UI. You got to fit more of these things in here and stuff like that. And sometimes that's hard to get people on board with, stuff like that. So just kind of consider how the effect of not having enough for players to do. And ideally, we would have had more unlockables if you had completed an level or something like that. But there's only so many resources we got from the license holder, stuff like that. But and then my deepest shame. Oops, missed a spot. In Justice League Cosmic Chaos, one of the side quests was to complete bounties on behalf of a villain from Superman's Rogues Gallery, Lobo, before you eventually fight him yourself. We scaled the required level of each bounty across the mid and late game, so it was kind of expected that you would kind of reach him pretty late to fight him. This may or may not have, been the case, especially with how broken a build can be, if you know what you're doing. But beating him, at least in the Switch release version, doesn't give you much experience. So if you did fight him earlier than level 30, which is the max level, you would get nothing except some money because all of the quests give you money for, in that quest line, because that's, you're doing bounties on his behalf. So just make sure you're testing at all levels, and but on the bright side, you do get to ride his bike after you beat him. So lastly, a bonus. Here's an economy thing we actually got to implement that I think was a good change overall. I believe it was some positive stuff. A lot of the aspects of Justice League ended up being built around like threes. Okay, we have 3 upgraded levels for each ability. We have 3 upgraded ability levels for each, support character that you pick up. And we also had like 3 acts. We had 3 tiers of enemies. It was like, oh, it made so much sense to have like one material for each tier and different kind of stuff. And it just felt kind of unwieldy. Lower level enemies would give the cracked versions, polished would come from the highest ones. Kind of late in the process, but we decided cut the middle thing, clean it up. Also because despite being 3 levels, that's actually 2 upgrade steps, and it was just a lot easier to conceptualize. All right, low level upgrade, high level upgrade. There's some other stuff I ended up doing, like focusing polish stuff and keeping that kind of rare to keep it. I know I'm like, okay, I should point to the screen on here. So we decided to streamline the currencies, and then the mid-game enemies gave you a chance to give you this high-end stuff, high-end materials, and it kind of like gave you this little surprise. And it's like, oh yeah, like it wasn't just like, all right, here, insert slot, mid-tier into mid-tier ability, insert high level into high level, but it actually made you actually have to choose, like, where am I going to put my pearls, stuff like that. Another thing that we kind of implemented was, here we brought back Carla Clams as a little joke for ourselves. She and another vendor would actually convert currency. So if you had too much of a high level one, say you were grinding forever for whatever reason, and you had so much lower level materials, you could then sync that into this exchange and get, the materials you do need. These ended up being a little hidden, but I think if you're thorough and you care about that kind of stuff, you're going to end up, liking that. Other vendors would also give you exchange materials. So definitely a way, trying to keep ways to keep currency flowing from one version to another. And that's pretty much it. It's a little double time here, but thank you. Also, hire me. Thank you. Bye.
Thank you, Jason, for a presentation that felt aimed at me. I'm just glad I'm not the only person doing it.
Do we have any questions or
questions from the audience? We have questions from Tom. Oh,
okay.
Well, Tom works on his question. Do we have any questions from the internet? Figure out yet, Tom? Sure. And I don't know. I have an anecdote.
Sure.
Do you have a specific placeholder number that you like to start with in designing an economy as like a starting point, then adapting or growing, or is it, how do you decide where to start with an economy? Is it based on like the design scope, or is there like a play time you're trying to hit, or do you have like a certain number that like you like to start?
That's a good question. Tom is asking, is there a number that I like to start with. We like to start with, you know, to figure out, you know, just to base off like a good feeling number or based off of time and stuff like that. And I think it depends on the project. I wish I could talk about the next game because I think I did pretty good job of standardizing a feel there. But like in that one, that was I wanted to stick to some like certain basic round numbers and then multiply them based on like how difficult I felt the activity was, you know, because that's more of an open world sandbox and keeping it so that and just trying to find like a good ratio of how much rewards come from a certain type of activity versus like side quest activity versus main activities and stuff like that. And then finding a good number there for some end game unlocks. That was well, that's a single currency in that one. I think for Justice League in particular, I think for that I started with looking at how much you would tend to get from certain enemies, you know, and to round those out to a good, you know, feeling number. I mean, like you don't want it to like to be too granular, like of like here's ones and twos, and sometimes or you know, I was trying to find my spreadsheet from that. I think I didn't grab it before I left. So I might have to look around to. So I'm trying to remember exactly what I did for that one, but
You started with like a base number and it's like, oh, for a single enemy, it'd be great. It'd feel good to get this amount, and then you started adding those up. to
yeah,
develop a larger amount.
yeah, like we would give each enemy a certain like it feels good if they drop, you know, one or two, you know, up to like the 1 to 5, you know, materials, and then say like, okay, well, you have to fight X number of those enemies, you know, and how much are those? I actually did count how many enemies we had specifically spawned in each dungeon in Justice League as just like a baseline. Like if you are going through the main story and not grinding on the overworld, or maybe I kind of fudge that number, you know, I'd be like, okay, you know, I expect you to beat up 5 to 10 enemies as you're walking through. You can beat up way more than that, and it is kind of easy to over level in Justice League. But that was like my baseline was like, okay, like here's a good looking number. You know, if it's too low, it's kind of hard to be like have that much variation. If it's too high, then it's like, oh, like well, it's just a bunch of 20s, 30s, and it just kind of But it's because they're all numbers. It's all relative, and you can just multiply and divide as needed. I have not used, Rob has a question here in the chat. Do you rough out or simulate the economy in a spreadsheet or something fancy like machinations? Living in spreadsheets, definitely. Definitely try to also standardize things and have formulas where I can grab, like, again, like that place I was going through and counting all the enemies in each dungeon and then multiplying those by my expected XP values there and the average resources. So if they have a range of like, okay, they might give you 5 of the low level material and maybe a small chance of a high level material, and just kind of rough that out just so like I could have some baseline of that, how much you would have. And then I would also fill chests. I had a spreadsheet for all the chests in the game, and both of those numbers I combined, and that's how I came up with numbers for the ability upgrades, and how much like I could expect you to have. Maybe you'd have a certain number of pearls to unlock high level abilities later, stuff like that. So I living in spreadsheets, and I in the game that's coming out, I had a little star system like, okay, this is a 5-star activity, this is a 3-star activity, because actually there's a little thing in the UI, like when you complete that quest line, it would be like, all right, 3 stars, and here's 15 currency units, and then